to another week of Math 060 Math Study Skills. This week we're going to talk about ways to utilize the homework process to hopefully maximize your learning of mathematics. So, homework allows you to practice, and as we've already talked a little bit about, practice is one of the key elements to learning mathematics. Math is a skill. Skills are things that we have to repeat and go through and do, like someone learning to play music, or someone learning to play a sport, or someone learning how to carve statues out of logs with a chainsaw. These are all things that we can get better at through practice. Homework is going to be the primary method that your instructor offers for practicing math. And even if your instructor doesn't really assign or offer you homework opportunities, you should still try to do some kind of homework on your own for practice. You're going to want to make sure that you're practicing the types of things that it is likely you'll be quizzed and tested on. And if you've taken good notes from and that's using the ideas from our previous lectures, you should have a pretty good idea of what it is that your instructor plans to quiz and test you on. Remember, the goal of homework is ultimately to learn that material well enough so that you can do it without any kind of assistance. You may need assistance on your homework at first, but your goal is going to be, we'll talk about this on the next slide as well, moving from needing assistance to no longer needing assistance so that you can perform well on quizzes and tests. Most instructors, at least math instructors anyway, are not going to allow books or notes on quizzes and tests, so you need to be able to work without those things. And even in the cases where your instructor does allow you to have an open book or to bring some kind of notes to the test, it's always a good idea to kind of prepare as if they're not going to let you have them. That way, if you forget where to find something in the book, or if you forget to put something on your notes, you're still reasonably well prepared for the test, and you're not completely reliant on just the books and the notes for the work you do. So, to be successful, at least at first with homework, you typically need to access your book, your notes. You may need to ask your instructor questions. You may need to talk to your fellow students, ask them questions, maybe friends that know the math that you're taking. Maybe you'll go to the math lab to get some support, etc. And those are all really good things to do while you're learning the material. But you need to try to use them less and less over time until you get to a point where you no longer need those sources of assistance so that you can do the math on your own. Always keep in mind that you won't have those forms of help on a test. So study, learn, and plan and prepare for that event. So one of the most common misconceptions, as the slide says, about math homework is that what you're trying to do is get to the correct answer. And that isn't necessarily true. Oftentimes what we're trying to do is learn about the process for getting the answer. Sometimes there's multiple ways to get an answer. When you're taking an algebra course, there are sometimes arithmetic tools you can use to get to the answer without ever doing any algebra. But if you're not learning the algebra, you're not learning the material of the course. So that's one way in which getting the correct answer isn't necessarily the most important thing. Sometimes we just get lucky and get the correct answer. Sometimes we just guess and get the correct answer. Sometimes we can look at a problem and kind of realize, well, this makes sense for the correct answer. But make sure you're always focused on process. Often in math classes, especially algebra classes and beyond, your instructor is trying to teach you about a process, a way of thinking. And the early simple problems you can get quick answers to. If you don't learn the process, the later and harder and more complicated problems will suddenly seem completely impossible because you don't have a good process to work with in the first place. So you want to develop methods for identifying the kinds of problems that you're working with, identifying the tools you need to deal with certain types of problems, determining the kinds of steps that you should need to follow to solve a problem. And working on all those things will allow you to eventually find the final answer. So spend a lot of time thinking about those first 3 bullets there. Identifying problems. What kind of problems are you looking at? Identifying the tools that you know to solve those problems. And making sure you understand the steps involved in applying those tools to solving those problems. Make sure you have those things, and getting to the final answer usually becomes a bit easier. going to give you 4 slides here that have a variety of suggestions for things you can do to make the homework process as valuable to you, hopefully, as possible. So one good idea is to work on your homework as soon as you can after class, as well as working on the homework. You can reread the section in the textbook, you can rework your notes, but try to work on that homework while the material from the lecture is as fresh in your mind as possible. It's always a good idea to find a place with few distractions. Distractions are different for different people, so try to minimize those things that distract you personally. Make sure you have everything you need. Lots of supplies, pencils, paper. If you need a special calculator, if you need a straight edge, make sure you have those things available to you when you start. Always try to begin your homework with a positive attitude. If things get frustrating, your attitude will deteriorate a bit. If you don't start with a positive one and start with a negative one, there's really no place left to go in terms of your attitude, and it takes a bit of a reasonable attitude to have some success with math homework. Finally, be ready to learn from your mistakes. You will make mistakes. They are part of the learning process, and sometimes mistakes are more valuable than just simply getting something right the first time. When you find yourself making mistakes, try to understand why. Try to understand why what you're doing is incorrect, why the correct procedures are correct, and use that as a learning opportunity. Make sure you read through your notes in your textbook, in your own notes. Try problems in your notes on your own, and then check them using your notes. Try example problems in the textbook on your own. Check them using the textbook. Always read directions carefully. Make sure you know what the problem is asking you to do and what kind of answer is expected from you. See if you can identify the kind of problem you're working on. This is most valuable if you can use your own words and kind of develop your own system for identifying and categorizing problems. What you want to do is minimize the number of categories you have. The fewer categories that you can lump all the different problems into, the easier it will be to find a solution technique. And while you're first working on the homework, don't be afraid to write down your category names next to problems to help you categorize things. This isn't always possible, but it's a good idea to try to estimate the answer, or at least get an idea of the kinds of numbers or answers that would make sense and those that wouldn't. And you want to work through the problem neatly and methodically. You want to write out your steps. It doesn't hurt to take a little bit of time and write brief explanations of your steps next to your steps. You'll see that a lot of textbooks do this. When you think you've worked through something or you're stuck, go back and reread the directions, see if you've missed some piece of information or interpreted something incorrectly. And don't be afraid to look at examples as well to see if there are similar examples that can kind of help guide you through a problem. Again, remember, you need to wean yourself off of these things eventually, but especially when you're first working on homework, these are good ideas. When you're done, go back and reread the question and make sure your answer is what was asked for, especially with word problems. Sometimes with longer problems, we finally get to a number and we feel like we have an answer, but it's not always the answer the problem was asking for. So it's always a good idea when you're done to go back and reread, make sure that what you did was what is expected and you're actually answering the question. And then finally, check your answer against your estimate or by substituting if you can. That works often in algebra-based classes. A lot of times textbooks have answers to some of the problems in the back of the book, so you can check them. Occasionally there's something called a student solutions manual that you can purchase from the bookstore that will provide answers and even worked out solutions to some of the problems. I want to just, before I move on to the next slide, talk briefly about the estimate idea. What I mean by kind of estimating or at least determining what an answer might look like is thinking about what's reasonable, not necessarily getting a really good answer or a really good estimate. I estimate the answer 6 and it turns out to be 6.2. It doesn't have to be anything that good. But if you're working on a problem where you're maybe trying to figure out what your monthly payment is for a mortgage, you know that that number shouldn't be a negative number because that implies the bank is paying you to own the house, not the other way around. And you probably have a reasonable feel for the fact that your mortgage payment, unless it's a super expensive house, probably isn't going to be thousands of dollars a month either. So sometimes we can just kind of common sense check our answers and use that as a way to estimate or bound what reasonable answers are. If you had a hard time with a problem, try it again. Try to do it a different way. But make sure you come back to problems you've had a hard time with and give them another chance. If you just can't solve a problem, try to make sure you've tried everything you can think of first. If you have, make a note next to the problem, maybe a big question mark, move on, but make sure at some point you go back and get help with that problem from your instructor, the math lab, in whatever way works for you. And when you're finished, go back to the beginning and retry a few of the early problems, and especially problems you did well on. It's always a good idea to finish on a positive note. Try to restore that positive attitude that you hopefully started with. Finally, a couple of last tips. Always make sure you get all of your questions answered. You can talk to your fellow classmates, you can talk to your instructor, you can talk to folks in the math lab. But if you have questions, make sure you get them answered. You want to think about the main concepts covered in the assignment, and you can go back and rework your notes again. So the note-taking process really kind of almost never ends. All right? Update your notes, improve your notes based on the work you've done in the homework. Finally, if your instructor allows it, work with other students on your homework, but be careful you're not copying from them. You're just talking to them and still doing your own learning along the way. Remember, you're ultimately responsible for your learning, and you need to do everything you can that allows you to learn the material and get to the point where you can solve the math problems you need to solve on quizzes and homework.